Under the Speaker's announced policy of January 3rd, 2017, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Evans, is recognized for 60 minutes as the designee of the Minority Leader.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to say for the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, I appreciate this honor and this opportunity, as well as all the other members for giving me this opportunity to kick off the second session of the Congressional Black Caucus Special Order Hours. Mr. Speaker, I ask unanimous consent that all members have 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks, including any extraordinary material on the subject of this order.
Without objection.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank my colleagues, as I said earlier, for this opportunity. This is truly an opportunity for a young man who comes from the city of Philadelphia and who grew up in the streets of Philadelphia and who had the opportunity as a product of the public school system, product of community college, and LaSalle University. Standing here today in a seat with many of my predecessors, 5 African Americans from the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, starting off with Robert N.C. Nix. Our theme tonight is the history of the CBC and the legacy of Martin Luther King. Next week, we begin a celebration of the birthday of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. King was not only a great man, but a great patriot who loved America and the ideas of the underpinning of our democracy. To kick off our discussion, I want to open up with 2 Dr. King comments, really capture our current political climate and what is at stake. The first quote, "We may have come over here on different ships, but we're all in the same boat now, Dr. King." And the seeming quote is, "Of all forms of inequality, injustice, and health care, and the most shocking and inhumane, Dr. Martin Luther King." When we think about this great nation and our leaders before us, like Dr. King, who came together to lay a framework for equal pay, fair wages, health care, equality in housing, so much more, we are reminded of what is at stake and how much we have to lose in this current political climate. We have a lot to lose under the current administration's destructive policies, and Dr. King would be greatly disappointed at many things going on in this country right now that affects all of our communities. We're in the business of doing no harm, but we must continue to fight to show results and solutions that help move our neighborhoods forward. Dr. King fought to move our neighborhoods forward when the odds were stacked against him. There are many examples of his life, legacy, and lasting impact in the city of Philadelphia. Take, for example, which is in the 2nd Congressional District, Dr. King Memorial Mural at 40th and Lancaster Avenue. He had a rally of 10,000 people when Dr. King was there. The yearly luncheon that C. Dolores Tucker, the late C. Dolores Tucker, sponsored in the honor of Dr. Martin Luther King. It's important to recognize that his connection to Pennsylvania in the Divinity School in Chester in Delaware County. Dr. King came many times to the city of Philadelphia and to the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. He had huge influence on a lot of us. And on this April 4th, 50 years later, when I was in junior high school or entering high school in 1968, he had a huge effect on me. He was someone who walked with kings and queens. He demonstrated to all of us with that message of peace. He was relentless in terms of standing up for freedom and justice. He showed all of us what it is to be a leader. You will hear over the next 60 minutes a number of my colleagues who have all either directly or indirectly been connected with Dr. Martin Luther King and what he has meant. We need to conduct this as a large teach-in. That's what this should be. This should be a teach-in, so we can share to everybody in this country what Dr. King was about and the importance that it did. So what I'd like to do at this point, Mr. Speaker, is yield to the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Chairman Richmond.
I want to thank my colleague from Pennsylvania, Congressman Dwight Evans, for allowing me this time to speak. And I heard him talk about Dr. King's roots and influence in Pennsylvania. I just want to know, and this will be the only small moment of my remarks, is that as a Morehouse man, we remind everyone that Dr. King started at the age of 16 in his matriculation through college and his embarking on the world knowledge that he had at Morehouse College, which I spent just a few years at and graduated from myself. Let me say, and I hope that there are a number of young people watching today, as well as those seniors whose backs I stand on, because a lot of people talk about Dr. King's dream. And I just want to say here publicly, and I've said it privately so many times, we don't honor the dream. Everybody has a dream. The question becomes whether you have the courage, the fortitude, and the willingness to sacrifice your future to make that dream come true. And in this body, and as chair of the Congressional Black Caucus, which now represents almost 78 million Americans, and serving with real icons who paved the way to make this a more perfect union, I appreciate now more than ever the sacrifice that went into making this country what it is. And because of that, and because of this time, let me just give 30 seconds of my history. My mother is from the poorest place in the United States. She had 15 brothers and sisters, and all she had was a mother, a very dedicated mother who was a housekeeper. We call her domestic or some other fancy term now. But she was a woman that woke up every day, that went clean other people's houses to make sure that her 15 kids had an opportunity at a better future. And you know what created that better future? Historically black colleges and universities. My mother went to Southern University. She shared a jacket with her sister, who was still in Lake Providence, which is about 200 miles away. I don't know how you do it, but they did it. But my mother, in that HBCU, because of the work of many people, was able to achieve an education which is the best way to lift yourself out of poverty. And she instilled in me two things. One, Cedric, you have to work hard. You have to do everything twice as good as everyone else so you can make it. And two, once you make it, you have an obligation to give back. That's what's so special about Dr. Martin Luther King and the dream and the day that we celebrate. A lot of young people sit around and say, oh, when I make it, I'm going to give back. Oh, when I grow up, I'm going to do something. Well, Dr. King did everything that he did at a young age. If you talk about the Montgomery bus boycott, if you talk about our leaders in the civil rights movement, they didn't wait to grow into leadership. They created their own path. And the remarkable thing is many of them sacrificed not only their future, but their life. So when you talk about Dr. King, and to a lot of my middle-class African Americans, let me say this. Dr. King could have sat back and said, I have mine, you get yours. Or my family is comfortable, so I will take the easy path. So for all of us that are doing well, remember there are a whole bunch of people who are not. We have this ice storm all across the country right now where we are hunkering down in our homes with heat. We have to remember that there are people that are hunkering down on the street, sleeping outside under a blanket because that's all they have. So we have to, in the spirit of Dr. King, remember that we're the greatest country on earth, and if we don't think it's a perfect union, we have to make it a more perfect union. And even if it cost us our life, like it did Dr. King, and it cost him his life in Memphis, fighting for sanitation workers, we have to fight for the least among us, because this country is only as great as it's the least among us. And as long as there are people sleeping on the streets during this blizzard, that means this country is failing. When there are kids in public school that are destined for failure because we have not funded our public schools, this country is failing. So I would just say that all of the great things about Dr. King, the one thing that we should remember, his sacrifice, the courage, and the fact that he gave his life to make our lives a better life. And with that, let me just say that as I grew up going to some of the best schools in the country, integrated schools, because of Dr. King and because of the person that I'm going to introduce, I know I stand on their backs, and I know that I have a lot of work to do to make sure that the generation behind me has that ability. But sacrifice is not easy. And when I think of it, I think of people that I read about in my textbooks, people I studied, people I admired, people whose autograph I sought. And now I actually get to call this gentleman, this distinguished gentleman from Georgia, a friend. But he's more than a friend. He's an icon. He is a trailblazer. He is a person who saved this country. And he, as a teenager, started his civil rights fight. He marched across the Edmund Pettus Bridge knowing that there was hatred on the other side. And he met hatred with love. And he was beaten because he loved and they hated. But you know what he did? He marched again. You know what he did? He ran for Congress. You know what he did? He welcomed me into this Congress, and he paved a better way for generations so that we could go to some of the best schools in the country. So with that, Mr. Speaker, and to the gentleman from Pennsylvania who yielded, I have an opportunity to present, introduce, yield time to one of the greatest Americans to ever walk on the face of this earth, one who has sacrificed blood, sweat, tears, and who has stayed on his knees constantly praying for a better country. But he reminds us all that the Lord will order your steps, but you have to move your feet. And he moved his feet across that Edmund Pettus Bridge, and he was beaten so that I could vote without counting how many bubbles in a bar of soap or how many jelly beans in a big tub. So with that, I will yield back my time to the distinguished gentleman from Pennsylvania, Congressman Evans, so that he can recognize one of the greatest Americans and the greatest member serving in this House of Representatives, the Honorable John Lewis from Georgia. Thank you, and I yield back.
I want to thank our chairman, and that's why he is our chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, because you just heard him so eloquently express his thoughts and his feelings, and he has done a fantastic job as the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, and I thank him. Always recognize the importance of what he brings to all of us. The gentleman is correct. The next person I want to add my voice to what he just said is, I was 11 years old when he went across the Pettus Bridge. I recall seeing it on CBS. Did not understand it, but now, like the chairman, I serve in this body with him. I'm a part of this body, and as I watch him and as I listen to him, all of the drive and the energy that he has, and he's always extremely positive. I have not met a person who's more positive and optimistic about the future of this country. As he says and talks about walking in his shoes, I remember that he said that. And I remember that opportunity when I was down in Alabama and on that Pettus Bridge along with him and a good friend, colleague from Alabama, Terry Sewell, that I thought to myself, I said, self, here I am with Congressman Lewis. He is someone who is renowned in his body and in his country and around the world. So I'd like to yield to my good colleague, the Honorable John Lewis.
Speaker, I want to thank my friends for yielding. Thank you, Mr. Evans. And thank you, the chairman of the CBC, Cedric Richmond. It is true that I grew up in rural Alabama, 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little place called Troy. It is true that my father was a sharecropper, a tenant farmer. But in 1944, when I was 4 years old, and I do remember when I was 4, my father had saved $300, and a man sold him 110 acres of land. We picked cotton. We gathered peanuts. We pulled corn. And sometime I would be out there working in the field, and I would fall behind, and my mother would say, boy, you need to catch up. And I would say, this is hard work. And she would say, hard work never killed anybody. I said, well, it's about to kill me. But one day, 15 years old in the 10th grade, I heard of Martin Luther King Jr. I heard of Rosa Parks in 1955. The action of Rosa Parks, the words and leadership of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. inspired me to find a way to get in the way. So 2 years later, I wrote a letter to Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1957. And I told him in this little letter that I wanted to attend a state-supported college called Troy State, now known as Troy University. It didn't admit black students. Dr. King wrote me back and sent me a round-trip Greyhound bus ticket and invited me to come to Montgomery to meet with him. In the meantime, I've been accepted at a little college in Nashville, Tennessee, American Baptist College. But Dr. King got back in touch with me and said, when you're home for spring break, come and see me. So in 1958, boarded a Greyhound bus and traveled from Troy to Montgomery. And a young lawyer by the name of Fred Gray, who had been a lawyer for Rosa Parks and for Dr. King, met me at the First Baptist Church, pastored by the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and took me in to see Dr. King and Reverend Ralph Abernathy. And Martin Luther King Jr. said, are you the boy from Troy? Are you John Lewis? And I said, Dr. King, I am John Robert Lewis. But he still called me the boy from Troy. This man inspired me to stand up, to find a way to get in the way, or find a way to get in trouble, in good trouble, necessary trouble. He said, if you want to go to Troy State, we will help you, but we may need to file a suit against the state of Alabama, against Troy State. Go back and have a discussion with your mother and your father. Tell them the home may be bombed or burned. They can lose the land. I went back. My mother was so afraid. My father was afraid. So I continued to study in Nashville. And from time to time, Dr. King would come and visit Nashville and speak at mass meetings and rallies. But he inspired me, along with Rosa Parks and others, to get involved. He led the Montgomery bus boycott for more than 381 days. People walked the streets. They shared cars and rides. They stood in unmovable lines. But they never gave up. Dr. King inspired us to stand up. He inspired us to believe in the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. So we would be sitting in at a lunch counter, waiting to be served, and someone would come up and spit on us, or put a lighted cigarette down our backs or in our hair, pour hot water, hot coffee on us. But we obeyed his instruction. So I got arrested a few times during the 60s, 45 times. But I never gave up. Just think, in 1961, the same year that President Barack Obama was born, black people and white people couldn't leave the city, sitting together to travel on a Greyhound bus or a Trailway bus through the South. People arrested, jailed, beaten. But Dr. King met us in Montgomery, sheltered us in a church. And one night, while we were there in that church, when people were threatening to bomb the church or burn it down, he made a call to Robert Kennedy and told him about what was happening. And Robert Kennedy communicated to his brother, President Kennedy. And the president put the city of Montgomery under martial law. It hadn't been for Martin Luther King Jr., Robert Kennedy, and President Kennedy, some of us would have died in that church. But it led to the desegregation of public transportation all across the American South. More than 400 people, 400 of us, were arrested in Jackson, Mississippi. We filled the city jail, the county jail, and later the penitentiary at Parchman. But Martin Luther King Jr. changed America forever. He taught us how to live, and he taught us how to die. He taught us to be brave, to be courageous, to be bold. And if it hadn't been for Martin Luther King Jr., I don't know what would have happened to many of us, happened to America. Many of us of color, whether we're black, Latino, Asian American, or Native American, wouldn't be in this body. He opened up the political process. He was a man who believed in the way of peace, the way of love, believed in the philosophy and the discipline of nonviolence. In a few days, a few weeks, we will commemorate his passing. He was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. I was in Indianapolis, St. Anna with Robert Kennedy when we heard that Dr. King had been assassinated. We heard that he had been shot. Robert Kennedy announced that he had died. And I think when Dr. King died, something died in all of us. Something died in America. He left us the way of peace, the way of love, the way of hope. And I hope that all young people and people not so young will commemorate and learn something about the teaching of Dr. King. And I want to thank the chair of our caucus, Congressman Richmond, and you, Mr. Evans, my friend and brother, for having the vision to hold this teach-in tonight, and I hope we will do more to explain to the American people and people around the world what Dr. King meant not just to Americans, but to the world community. And with that, I yield back and thank you again.
Mr. Speaker, I hope that what we just heard, and to our chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, that we can either through social media or whatever way, that was a learning experience that just took place. And to have Congressman Lewis, who was there, who was on the front lines, who's not talking about something he read, but something he's demonstrated through his own experience. That all of us, not just the Congressional Black Caucus, but this entire House, should thank him for the service and for being a patriot and for what he has expressed. So I personally want to thank Honorable John Lewis for taking that opportunity just to educate us, because we all need education, and we're never too wise to think we don't need someone to talk to us. Speaking of education, another good colleague from the great state of Texas. I know a little bit about that state. Everything is big in that state, they tell me. And she's in a seat that Congresswoman Jordan used to hold, and Mickey Leland, and she in her own right is doing a lot. And I've watched her in the period of time she's been in, just a year. She's a fantastic person. That's Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee from the 18th Congressional District. I yield to her.
Congressman Evans, I want to thank you for your mighty leadership.
I just want to ask the Speaker, how much time do we have?
The gentleman has 36 minutes.
Okay, sure.
For the mighty leadership that he has given and for the service that he gives to his constituents in Philadelphia. And I accept his challenge, and I accept the challenge of my chairman, Cedric Richmond, who told a story that hopefully will be an inspiration and a guide for all of those who believe that they are not yet mature enough to serve, to give, to offer to the beloved community that Dr. King so aptly speaks of. What can I say about John Lewis, whose moral guidance, but whose bloody brow was never bowed? I thank you, Congressman Lewis, for the straight talk, but the loving talk. To my colleagues that are here, I know that each will have a moment, so allow me to take just a moment to be able to offer my tribute in commemoration of Dr. King's life. But what a powerful year we face in 2018. And I'm so grateful to have left 2017. And I believe that this gives a fresh look to America. I looked at the movie Titans, and maybe you saw that with Denzel Washington, and it reflected a racial conflict with football players just outside of Washington and Virginia. It's a moving story of how if you get young people together, we can break the chains of racism and differences. It brought tears to my eyes because 2017, we went that journey again, and I was hoping that we would come in this year, the commemoration year, to accept Dr. King's challenge of a beloved community. I salute my community of Houston. Some say there was no civil rights movement, and I beg to differ with them. Dr. King came one time, and the clergy gathered. Most of them gathered. Those who were afraid, we know that most were not. They were all ready to have the big rally, and wouldn't you know it, a bomb threat. But our Houstonians were ready to march and to be out front in spite of the fear of a bomb. I bet you that every community that Dr. King was either invited to or that they went to, there were people of courage who were willing to stand up and embrace freedom in the face of devastating potential disaster. So let me just say that my greatest claim for this legacy is my fight as a younger person to be part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. It will be my greatest honor to have been able to work for the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, to walk in that office on Auburn that I believe may not be, to meet Ralph David Abernathy because it was after the death of Dr. King, to know James Orange, and to know the brother that walked with the wooden leg, and to know Andy in a way that they were still engaged in Dr. King's work. And I'm reminded of the message that he has given to us. And as Chairman Richmond said, he was young, and he asked the question, life's most persistent and nagging question, he said, is what are you doing for others? And I think we as members of the Congressional Black Caucus and the adjunct of the foundation that works for young people, we have no doubt in what we're doing for others. But Dr. King gave us the words I'd like somebody to mention as he talked about his death on February 4th, 1968. This is what we should be doing in 2018. We should be talking about what we are doing in commemoration. I'd like somebody to mention on that day that Martin Luther King Jr. tried to give his life serving others. And he said, I want you to say on that day that I might have lost my life, that I did try in my life to love and serve humanity. So as I close, I want to remind those of us who have not yet made our journey to something that brought us closer to Dr. King, that this body, this group of Republicans and Democrats, this administration, we need to unshackle ourselves. This question of race needs to be thrown under the bus of the beloved community, and we need to be able to dream like Dr. King did and say, but he learned to use his imagination when he saw this separation, and his dreams to see right through it, white-only signs to see the reality that all men and women, regardless of their place of origin, their gender, or their creed, are created equal. What a visionary. And so I close with his braveness in 2 points. One, his answer to the question about who are we as a nation and what this citizenship should mean. And he simply turned us back to the Declaration of Independence and said, that we simply should have citizens that can live out the words written in its Declaration of Independence to have a place in this nation's Bill of Rights. We simply want to be like others. And he took this courage to his death. For at the end of his death, he was not ashamed to go to Riverside Church and stand against the Vietnam War. While others look aghast, afraid, why are you stepping out of your box? Dr. King said that I believe in the beloved community, a dreamer with works and actions. And so I close in that faithful journey that he made, that we will be commemorating, all converging on Memphis, Tennessee, and the American Federation of Municipal Workers, who were forged and born in the shadow of 2 sanitation workers that were killed in the line of their duty, and Dr. King felt compelled to be there. When do we feel compelled? On the tax bill, on the CHIPS, on federally qualified health care, on affirmative action. When are we taking this, in essence, to the mat? Because that's what Dr. King did. He took it to the mat. And he went to the mat in the face of violence. And he told us in his last words that he had been to the mountaintop. He had seen the promised land. And he did not know if he would get there someday, but he knew that we as a people would find a way to that pathway. I thank the gentleman for yielding to me, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, the next person I'd like to yield to, my colleague from Texas sort of gave a great lead-in for her from the great state of California. As Dr. King stood up against the Vietnam War, she knows a little bit about standing up. If you know anything about the Honorable Barbara Lee from the 13th Congressional District, you know she don't mind being by herself. So I'd like to yield to my colleague from the great state of California, Councilwoman Lee.
Thank you very much, Congressman Evans, for yielding, but for that gracious introduction. But more importantly, for your magnificent leadership. You have come to Congress hitting the ground running. And it truly has been and is in the spirit of Dr. King. So thank you very much. And to our chair, Congressman Cedric Richmond, I want to thank you for your steady leadership, and it is steady, of our caucus, and for helping us to stay focused on this special order on the evenings which we do these to honor the life of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., who was and is our drum major for justice. And to Congressman John Lewis, I just have to say to you, I owe you a debt of gratitude. I would not be here if it were not for you. And I want to say on behalf of my young people at the Martin Luther King Freedom Center, who have a chance to be with you every year. Now it's been about 17 years. How much you have, and Congresswoman Terry Sewell, how much you have touched their lives and have turned their lives around, and how they understand now what fighting for justice and peace really means by being part of your efforts and by your mentoring them and teaching them that the beloved community is not only a dream but can be real. So thank you, Congressman Lewis, so much. It's an honor to know you and to serve with you. This year, as we remember the man and the movement that transformed really the soul of America, it's really important that we honor the fullness of Dr. King's dream. So while we remember Dr. King's birthday this month, we also are reminded that it was 50 years ago, on April 4th, that he lost his life to an assassin's bullet. Dr. King was a crusader for civil rights, voting rights, and peace, but he was also a warrior for economic justice and ending poverty. In fact, one of Dr. King's most memorable speeches, of course, I've been to the mountaintop. It was given in Memphis, Tennessee at a time when Dr. King was determined to transform the civil rights movement into an intersectional economic justice revolution. A few months before his death, 2 young African-American workers were crushed to death by a faulty truck in Memphis. The American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, AFSCME, union members went on strike, and Dr. King was right there with them, lending his support. In a speech to the sanitation workers on strike, Dr. King explained why he was there. He said, "Our struggle is for genuine equality, which means economic equality. Dr. King said that to thousands gathered at Mason Temple. He said, "For we know that it is not enough to integrate lunch counters. What does it profit a man to be able to eat at an integrated lunch counter if he doesn't have enough money to buy a hamburger?" Dr. King had come to signal the dawn of a new era in the struggle. He was there to stand with workers who were sick and tired of low wages, unsafe working conditions, and the city's refusal to recognize their union. He was there because he believed that labor rights, civil rights, and human rights are one and the same. He was there because he understood the simple truth that there can be no racial justice without economic justice. Tragically, while fighting to secure the American dream for all Americans, Dr. King was assassinated on April 4th, 1968. Now, that was a day that changed my life. Congresswoman Jackson Lee mentioned where she was. We all remember that moment. I was living in San Jose, California, and was commuting to San Francisco about an hour away by train. I returned that evening. My car was parked in the train's parking lot. I got off the train, turned on the radio, and the news came through that Dr. King had been killed. Well, I sat in my car for I don't know how long, and I cried. I was shocked like everyone, saddened and angry. But I was also motivated to fight for the dream that Dr. King envisioned. My job, I quit my job. At that moment, I knew that I had to do something. So I became involved, John, as a community worker with Bobby Seale and the Black Panther Party. But it was Dr. King's assassination that catapulted me into the movement. And I was determined to prove that even though the assassin killed the dreamer, he could not kill the dream. Right now in this country, the work of Dr. King went to Memphis to achieve, that work remains unfinished, which is what we intend to complete. 47 million Americans remain locked in poverty. Discrimination and institutional racism continue to hold livable wages hostage. And the economic wealth divide, it grows deeper every day in urban and in rural communities. Now, I represent the 13th Congressional District of California, a great district where there's an explosion of wealth in the Bay Area, which has recently experienced also a spike in median household income. It's a hub of innovation and creativity, yet in many ways it's a tale of two cities. Black households in my district have been locked out of this explosion of wealth. According to the Census Bureau, the median income in the Bay Area jumped by 9%, while the median income for black households inched up just 2%. And it's not just wealth inequality. 23% of black households are poor, and 43% of black children in my district are considered poor in Oakland, and these numbers have remained stagnant year after year after year. This is unacceptable. It's not just my district that experiences this wealth divide. Recent studies shown that if trends persist, median black household wealth could hit 0 by 2053. So this alarming possibility makes one thing clear. The work to achieve Dr. King's dream must continue, and members of the Congressional Black Caucus tirelessly continues the work both inside this Congress and in our communities, because there is still much that we must overcome. As the conscience of the Congress, the Congressional Black Caucus fights every day to dismantle barriers that prevent low-income people, poor people, and people of color from having a fair shot at the American dream. Dr. King's legacy can be found in our efforts to give communities of color, struggling families, women, a fair shot at improving their basic living standards. There are many bills, Congressman Bobby Scott's bill to raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, Congresswoman Alma Adams closing the Meal Gap Act. There are many bills that many members of the Congressional Black Caucus really are championing every single day to ensure that Dr. King's life and his death will be remembered, and that his death will not overshadow his life, and that his legacy of fighting, as Dr. King said, to make the promises of democracy real will live on for generations to come. Thank you, and I yield the balance of my time.
Mr. Speaker, the next person And I just had the pleasure of really meeting her this year. She is a lot of energy and a lot of drive. She got me to go to Alabama, and I had never been to Alabama before. But after her personality and her drive and her intellectual curiosity, and between she and John Lewis, what could I say? So I like to yield to the great member from the state of Alabama, the Honorable Terry Sewell, 7th District.
Thank you so much, Congressman Evans. You have so ably represented and lead the 2nd District of Pennsylvania. It's been an honor to call you colleague. I want to say, Mr. Speaker, that today I join with my CBC colleagues in honoring the extraordinary life and legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., 50 years after his tragic death. Today, we honor and celebrate the man who led our country in the fight against racism and injustice, a man who forged tools of nonviolence and compassion so that our nation could break the chains of segregation and Jim Crow. Today, we honor a man who refused to believe that racism and war would define our future and who fought to ensure that truth and love would be the final word. As the United States representative of Alabama's historic Civil Rights District, I know that Dr. King's selfless sacrifices changed the trajectory of our nation's history and changed the lives of so many in my district and around the world. When Birmingham was one of the most segregated cities in America, it was Dr. King who brought the civil rights movement home to Alabama during the Birmingham campaign. When 4 little black girls were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham, it was Dr. King who delivered their eulogy and who refused to let their deaths go unnoticed. Mr. Speaker, when the police beat marchers on a bridge in my hometown in Alabama, who were simply marching for the equal right to vote, it was Dr. King who helped with Dr. Reese and so many others to organize that march from Selma to Montgomery. It was foot soldiers like the Honorable John Lewis, who I am honored every day to be able to call colleague, who sacrificed their lives for the opportunity of a next generation to have the dream that so many wanted and fought for. There are constituents in my district, the civil rights and voting rights foot soldiers who marched with Dr. King, who answered the call to fight for justice. These foot soldiers faced fire hoses and police dogs and nightsticks that future generations of Americans could now have the equal right to vote. You know, Mr. Speaker, I get to cross the Edmund Pettus Bridge just to go home to see my folks, to visit my family in Selma, Alabama, to go to my hometown, to visit my friends, to live in a place that still needs help. You know, there's still some unfinished business of civil rights and voting rights. And it is my honor, my great honor, to invite year after year so many to come, thousands to come, to walk in the footsteps of John Lewis with John Lewis. It doesn't get any better than that. And for me to be able to say that I am the member from Alabama, I know that I stand on the shoulders of John Lewis and so many others, but I also know that I must get off your shoulders, that I must do the hard work, the unfinished business that is civil rights and voting rights in America. As long as there are voter suppression and people are not allowed to vote in this country, we have work to do. We have lots of work to do. And we must do our own work. It's not enough to just say thank you. It's not enough that we come before every year to reenact the march from Selma to Montgomery. It's not just about reenactment. It's about what we do day in and day out to further the dream that is Dr. King's, to build that beloved community that we talked about. You know, I get to see up close John Lewis and know that he is not just talking the talk. He walks the walk every day. And there are times when I am purely frustrated in this house. Frustrated because there's so much work that we need to do, and so much work that we don't do because of our dysfunction. And when I get tired, I just look over at John Lewis and I think to myself, this man never was tired. The hard work was done by so many before us. And those of us who get to walk these halls of Congress have to decide what we're going to do to help further that dream. Dr. King's life was not in vain. John, your work is not in vain. There are so many of us who know that we stand on your shoulders and know that in order for this country to live up to its ideals of justice and democracy for all, that we must, every generation must, continue that fight. You know, in Birmingham, it was Dr. King who wrote a letter from a Birmingham jail, who talked about injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And there are injustices everywhere. So we have work to do. We, the members of the CBC, take that challenge very seriously. But we, members of this House, this august body, must take that work seriously too. And that work is not a work that is Republican work versus Democratic work. It is America's work. It is the work of our democracy. It is the work that we must do, that our constituents sent us here to do, that so often is stifled by our rhetoric, stifled by our inability to see beyond our party, stifled by so many things. But I know for a fact that when we work hand in hand together, Republicans and Democrats, blacks and whites, those from different religions, that we can do amazing things. We know that because of the life and legacy of Dr. King. So on this 50th anniversary of his death, let us not mourn. Let us recommit. Let us recommit ourselves to that which he stood for that which John Lewis stands for, and that is justice for all, irrespective of what country they come from. You know, we're tried and tested every day, and it is important that we remember that we can all walk across that Edmund Pettus Bridge by doing the hard work of seeking justice and equality for all people, just because they're people. I yield back the balance of my time, and I honor again the great work of Dr. Martin Luther King.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can you tell me how much time we have, Mr. Speaker?
The gentleman has approximately 13 minutes.
Okay. Mr. Speaker, a gentleman I want to introduce is a neighbor. May you go across the Walt Whitman Bridge or the Ben Franklin Bridge. I've known him and I know his father, and he's doing a great job in the Garden State. Congressman Donald Payne. I yield.
Mr. Speaker, let me thank Congressman Evans for hosting tonight's special order hour on Dr. King's life and legacy. The gentleman from Philadelphia has come to this body and has made an impact in his first year on the floor of Congress. And we are delighted to have had him join the CBC. Mr. Speaker, as I sat here and listened to my colleagues, the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus, Cedric Richmond, a young man, not the eldest member of the caucus, but a young man that has demonstrated the leadership to be the head of this august body. And to hear my colleague, and I use the term in reverence, John Lewis, I am fortunate, Mr. Speaker, to be able to serve the 10th Congressional District of the state of New Jersey at this time. Because you see, I was sitting here as I listened to Barbara Lee and Sheila Jackson Lee and John Lewis, Terry Sewell, Mr. Evans, that to much is given, much is expected. And so I hear the story of the boy from Troy. I hear the story of my chairman, Cedric Richmond. But I've been fortunate in my life. Because you see, I had a father that felt that the most important thing to do was to serve this country and this world. And he instilled that in me. And a lot of his teachings come from Dr. Martin Luther King. 50 years after his death, Dr. King's legacy has been shrouded in myth by people who prefer being comfortable to being real. And Mr. Speaker, at this time, as the young people back in my district say, I'm going to keep it real. His personal truths have been twisted into lies by people who want to appear woke, but whose eyes are blind to the harsh reality of injustice. This year, in 2018, we must reclaim Dr. King's legacy for those who are apt to quote, "I have a dream," as they seek to silence people of color who are fighting to preserve that dream. Mr. Speaker, Dr. King understood that nonviolence does not mean non-confrontational. He knew that social change requires sacrifice. He knew that doing what is right does not mean doing what is always easy. When Black Lives Matter protesters peacefully rally in the streets to protest police brutality against young men of color, conservatives and white moderates shout that Black Lives Matter incites violence and should be peaceful like Dr. King. What they're really saying is, sit down, boy, and know your place. That is the same thing they said 55 years ago when Dr. King led peaceful protests against racial injustice in Birmingham, Alabama. Conservatives shouted that Dr. King was causing hatred and violence. They told him to sit down and to know his place, but he persisted. Dr. King was not in Birmingham to make everyone comfortable. He was there to upset the status quo and change our democracy. Then, 4 years later, Dr. King proclaimed that the Vietnam War was morally unjust. He pointed out that profit had become more important to the government than people who were sacrificing their lives overseas. Conservatives once again attacked Dr. King. They said he was being slanderous and that he was tragically misleading people. Well, now, Mr. Speaker, you see the great outcry and support that we have for our soldiers and our military people now in this country. We honor and revere them now. That came out of the struggle of the Vietnam War, where they were spat on and told that they weren't worth anything. That's where it came from Dr. King bringing up the unjust war that this was. So out of Dr. King's protests against the Vietnam War, we began a great reverence for our soldiers once again. And that's what we see now in the streets when we see a Vietnam vet and we tell them thank you for their service, or whether they were in Afghanistan, thank you for their service. It was Dr. King who first raised that issue. They told him to be quiet and to know his place. But like Dr. King told one of his friends at the time, he might have been politically unwise, but he was being morally wise, and that's what mattered. This year, in 2018, we must be morally wise. Dr. King's life and legacy shows us that doing right is really the same thing as doing what is easy. We too must persist. And as we head into a consequential year, when Americans will go to the polls, let us not lose sight of the fact to protect and preserve Dr. King's legacy demands that we protect and preserve our democracy from voter suppression, cybersecurity weakness, and foreign meddling. We must expand voting rights for all Americans. We must modernize our voting system. We must appoint an independent commission to investigate foreign meddling into the electoral system before the 2018 federal election. We must break down barriers to voting, not build them. We must make registering to vote easier, not harder. We must ensure elections are competitive and not guaranteed. We must restore the right to vote for felons who have served their prison sentences. And we must end partisan gerrymandering. We must protect the sanctity of our elections, and we must restore the Voting Rights Act. Dr. King knew that it was important. And as I go to my seat, I just want to thank my colleagues for their endurance, because as Amazing Grace says, I once was lost, but now I'm found. And how serving with these great people, the United States Congress, has saved a wretch like me. And I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The gentleman from the east, now I'm going to go to the west of Pennsylvania, someone who I have watched. She is an educator, and she's always teaching. And with this teaching that we're conducting, I'd like to yield to my colleague, the Honorable Joyce Beatty from the 3rd Congressional District of Ohio.
Thank you so much to my colleague, Congressman Dwight Evans, who hails from the 2nd District of Pennsylvania. Thank you for leading us tonight, and thank you to our Congressional Black Caucus Chairman, Cedric Richmond, for allowing us to come tonight. Mr. Speaker, I join my colleagues in coming to the floor tonight to mark the 50th anniversary of the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. We have made progress in these past 50 years, but the legacy and example of Dr. King shows us that much remains to be done. Although many marches and protests were met with violence, Dr. King and the women and the men who stood with him, like our very own colleague and Congressional Black Caucus member, Congressman John Lewis. As I listened to Congressman Lewis tonight, as I sat on this House floor and had the privilege and honor to call him a colleague and a friend, it reminded us of his courage and how much more work we have to do. It was through these peaceful protests, it was through their courage, it was through the power of the messages that they sent, that they stood up against the establishment. Dr. King was able to bring the injustices felt by African Americans nationwide to the forefront of American politics. His work culminated in the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, where hundreds of thousands of individuals came, all stripes, all communities, and they came for a call to justice and equality for all. It was on that day, on August 28, 1963, when Dr. King gave one of his most powerful and famous speeches, that passionate speech, "I Have a Dream," calling for the end of racism and the expansion of civil rights and economic rights. I am so proud that Mother Beatty's mother, my husband's grandmother, was an invited platform guest witnessing that speech. We have that picture in our office to remind us and to remind our children and grandchildren the power of Dr. Martin Luther King and Congressman John Lewis. With the emotions in the wheel of the march, it encapsulated in such powerful words, civil rights rose to the top of the agenda of reformers and facilitated the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And still, Mr. Speaker, Dr. King's work was not done. The next year, Dr. King helped to lead the Selma to Montgomery March. How proud I am that I was able to participate in the reenactment of that on its 50th anniversary. The march route spanned some 54 miles from Selma, Alabama to the state capital of Montgomery. The marchers were in response to the southern states' legislatures passing and maintaining discriminatory laws and practices over decades, where it meant to deny, Mr. Speaker, African Americans across the state, across the South, the right to vote. What is our message? What is our message tonight? We are here because we are still walking in it. We are still fighting for civil rights and voting rights and economic rights. We are still fighting for equal pay and for equal work, but we are not afraid. Mr. Lewis led us on this House floor fighting for gun safety. We are not afraid because we are continuing the legacy of Martin Luther King. And lastly, let me just say, we must break this cycle of economic inequality, racism, and poverty. We must stand up to the GOP and to President Trump, because when we look at this tax reform bill, it brings those injustices to economics, inequality, a financial gain. So we are here tonight to say there is still a dream. There is still a stone of hope. And I yield back. And again, I thank my colleague for leading us in this celebration and this tribute to Martin Luther King.
And I too thank my colleague for those eloquent words and those comments, which were very succinct and provided a lot. Mr. Speaker, we have about how much time?
The gentleman's time has expired.
Okay. I just want to say, Mr. Speaker, I move that the House adjourn, and thank my chairman from the Congressional Black Caucus for allowing me to have this opportunity. Thank you.
The question is on the motion to adjourn. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. The ayes have it. The motion is adopted. Accordingly, the House stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow for morning hour debate. Thank you.